Here's a scary story for you. I used to work in a hospital as a young adult, and there was this one thing that happened that I could never explain. So, hospitals have those intercoms that are hooked up to the nurses' stations. And at certain parts of the day, usually late at night, we would hear this loud voice booming over the intercom, "Code blue, code blue." When it went code blue, all the nurses would drop what they were doing and rush to the nearest elevator and head up to the sixth floor where the code was being called. Now, a code blue is when a patient either dies or has a cardiac arrest. And when we got up to the sixth floor, we would see doctors performing mouth-to-nose resuscitation on a patient. And after they were done with their shift, they would just leave the body in the room and walk out. No one ever said a word about it. No one ever acknowledged that these people were dying or had died. It was like we weren't allowed to acknowledge that these people were dying. The scariest part about this is that the code always seemed to happen in room 666. Now, this particular hospital was very old and it had a lot of history. But before I started working there, the sixth floor had been renovated. So when I started working there were no longer any rooms on the sixth floor that had numbers above 600. So technically, there shouldn't have been any room 666. There was also never an explanation for why the code blue was happening, or why it kept happening in room 666. One night, I was working the night shift and I was getting reports from the night before. And the night before, 3 people had died in room 666. The nurse said, "Yeah, it was crazy last night." We had 3 code blues back to back in room 666. And then after she said that, there was a pause, and then she whispered, "We don't even have room 666 on this floor anymore." I looked at her and I asked, "So where were these people dying?" And she just stared at me and shook her head and walked away. So the next time I was on the 6th floor, which was literally 2 minutes later, I went to check out room 666 just out of curiosity because I was like, maybe it's a supply closet. Maybe it's an old room that hasn't been taken off the system yet. And as I'm walking down the hallway, I start counting the rooms. And every single room had been removed except for room 666. And I walked in and it was an empty room with a bed in it. And the bed was literally ripped out of the wall. And I looked on either side of the room, thinking maybe they put a partition in here or something, but there was nothing. And the door was wide open. There was no reason for this room to exist. And I walked out and closed the door and I never went in there again. And then a couple weeks after that, I was working the night shift again, and I heard the call for code blue and I headed up to the 6th floor. And as I'm walking up, I'm thinking, wow, I wonder if this is gonna be the night that someone is gonna die in room 666. And when I got up there, I walked into the room and there was no one there. The bed was empty. I checked the other room down the hall and no one was in there either. And then I went back to the nurses' station and I asked them, I'm like, "Where's the code? Where's the code blue?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And I told them I just came from room 666 because that's where the code was called. And they were like, "We didn't have a code blue. We didn't have a code called on our floor tonight." And I was like, okay, well, then why did I just hear it? And they didn't have an answer for me. And that was the end of the story.